Talvez ano que vem apresente em português. But today will be in English. So, thank you to Professor Wagner and the whole UFMG team. It's honestly amazing to see this event growing. We were here in December and already things are changing so fast. So we are Gemini Sports. What we do is we provide a co-pilot kind of tool for executives at sports teams to make their most important decisions. This year, we're focusing on recruitment and talent identification, especially in football. So today, we'll update you on the company and what's changed since we saw you last. Zach, my colleague here, will talk about some industry trends and what we've learned from our customers. And then we'll finish the presentation by showing you a sneak peek of our mobile application and how we onboard teams to that. So who are we? I worked as a sports scientist in the professional sports world for about a decade. And when I was preparing a team for the 2016 Olympic Games here in Rio de Janeiro, I had to learn MATLAB and SQL and Python. And I was very, very bad at it. And I had the discovery that I think that the people who are making key decisions for teams every day and the people, the engineers who are creating insights for those decision makers probably shouldn't be the same person, because there's only 24 hours in the day. So in 2022, I had the idea to build a business based on this. Did I point at that? There we go. So I started to gather some investors to create this idea that I had in my head. And 2 years later, we've raised $7 million, including investors that own 27 sports teams. We've hired staff away from the NFL, from Major League Baseball, from the NBA, and from Atlético Mineiro. We've also partnered with companies like AWS, Snowflake, and Databricks to provide infrastructure for our clients that are trusted by the biggest companies in the world. But most importantly to me, we're saving about $500,000 a year for our customers in their operational expenses. So what's happening in the industry right now? Things are changing fast. There's a lot of new technology and a lot of data available. But at the end of the day, the thing that's most obvious to us is that the most expensive decisions involve deciding what players you want on your team and how you're going to sell players for a profit, because every team is trying to do that. In 2023, Premier League teams spent $5 billion. I know most of that was Chelsea, but they spent a lot of money on buying players. The best teams, the very best ones, have about a 50-50 success rate. And that's not good enough. That's a lot of money wasted. The decision makers at these teams are very data literate. There's a new generation coming through. They come from an economics background. They know how to use Excel. They love numbers and graphs. And there's a lot of people who probably were in this room or this kind of room at some point who are now technical directors and sporting directors, which is very exciting. But even as teams grow, and even as new technical people get into sporting director roles, there's more and more and more data available. And this creates a lot of headaches for a lot of people. And we'll get into it more later, but most teams don't want to hire data engineers, which creates a blockage. I'll hand it over to my colleague, Zach, to talk about what we've learned.
So we've established that teams have data and executives that want to use data. So that's a great starting point for everyone in here who wants to work in sports analytics. Those were the less fun problems to solve. Now we get to focus on the more fun problems of how we actually use this data to help teams make better decisions. So if you're a sports executive, your job is to win more games. But that effectively means your job is to predict the future. You have to look at player past performance and project how well they could help your team this year. You have to look at someone playing in an entirely different league and project how well they would do if they translated up a league. You have to allocate your budget most effectively because no one has unlimited resources. And you have to manage the risk profile on your team as well. There are injuries to deal with, team depth concerns. Do you take the safer prospect or the high floor, low, or the high ceiling, low floor prospect? All kinds of decisions that go into managing a team. Those are complicated questions. And to do that, we have to break them down into more manageable parts. So here's how we've chosen to view phase one of the models that we're building. Most of those executive questions devolve into one of these two on the left, either how good is this player or how does he fit? So then we can start expanding on those ideas by building all of these component models that continue to feed into each other and make each other better. So the first thing to consider in how good is the player is we can make an all-in-one metric. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but it's a single number evaluation of player talent. Once we have that and can trust that, we can build on forecasting that number or translating that number across different leagues or saying, what does that number mean in terms of dollars? And then on the style front, we can look at player clustering, player similarity, develop a fit score, recommendations. We can take the similar framework to our all-in-one metric and build categorical metrics for how good is this player at finishing or passing or what have you. And the fun thing about this is that this is actually translatable across all kinds of sports. Whether you're an executive in football, basketball, baseball, your job is to put the best product on the field given your budget constraints, and the same kind of process works across sports. Each of those little models is an entire talk unto themselves, so rather than do a deep dive into one, we're going to do a quick glance at several. The first one to talk about is that all-in-one metric. So one of the first things anyone coming from another sport learns when they start diving into football analytics is that people love radar charts in football analytics for some reason. And I have nothing against a radar chart. It's a nice way to view a bunch of stats at once. Got some color coding, I have no gripes. But put yourself in the shoes of a sports executive. You have to decide things like, is player A or player B going to help us more next year? You have to look at a player and say, we know we want that player, but what's a fair salary to compensate them with? Or you have to look at your budget and say, would we be better off spending all of this money on one star addition or making several small improvements to our roster? If you have a radar chart like that, it's hard to answer those questions. It's hard to compare 2 or 3 of those side by side, and it's impossible to compare the entire universe of players in a radar chart. So even though no responsible analyst would argue that absolutely every aspect of player value can be captured in a single number, getting as close as possible lets us narrow down the possibility space so we can then do the deep dive with our radar charts on the players that are like the most realistic targets for what we're trying to build. Fortunately, in sports analytics, we get to build on an entire history and foundation of people who have done this work before. Anyone working in sports analytics owes a great debt to baseball analysts of decades ago. And part of that is because some very bright people had some very visionary ideas, and part of it is because baseball is an easier sport to analyze. But their wins above replacement metric is really the foundation of all-in-one metrics across all kinds of sports. It's a simple one-number stat that roughly quantifies how many more wins you should expect to have as a baseball team over the course of a season with this player compared to a random player you could get promoted from the minor leagues. In my world in basketball, I worked for the Miami Heat for 7 years, and I've seen the evolution of all-in-one metrics throughout those years. Regularized adjusted plus minus was one of the biggest innovations, as it takes more than just your box score stats. It converts team impact and substitution patterns into a value for the team. And then these other alphabet soup of acronyms continued to build on that by combining box score impact events with your team substitution events to evaluate how much players help their teams win. And then moving on to football, it's not even that innovative here. Plenty of people have tried to do this idea. There's OBV, there's VAPE, plenty more out there in the world. So the foundation of any good all-in-one metric is that your goal as a sports executive is to win games. How do you win games? You outscore your opponent. This is advanced analysis. But any good metric is really just an evaluation of how much that player can help you outscore your opposition. So for our soccer all-in-one metric, we are borrowing from the foundations of baseball and basketball and other existing soccer metrics, and building out a combination of event-level stats and tracking their impact on team performance, as well as the team impact, substitutions. That way you get an evaluation of the no stats all-stars, the players that just make the right extra pass or know where to stand, things that aren't captured in your event data, but that do get captured by the fact that their teams just happen to always be better than their opposition. And you can see that translate into a screenshot of our application there on the right. We have examples of players, and then simple percentile views of their all-in-one score, as well as line graphs showing trends over time. The next topic to cover is the fact that stats don't just exist in a vacuum. Assembling a roster of just the 11 most talented players is not a recipe for success if they don't fit well together. You can have diminishing returns. So if you have a bunch of talented finishers, but no one to set them up, they're not going to fully realize their value. You could have an entire roster built out with very talented players, but with one crucial weakness. And as someone who's worked on the team side, going through another team's game plan and realizing they have this one crippling weakness that they can't deal with is a fun day for me, because I get to just write down all the ways we get to exploit that. You don't want to give other teams' analysts a good day, so you've got to limit that yourself. And then finally, you might just want to build a team identity. There might be certain traits that you think are undervalued, or certain ideals you want your team to signify. So you might want to be the fast team, or the smart team, or the tough athletic team. And so you might want to build those into your considerations, as well as just how talented are players. Over here, we have a visualization of tens of thousands of players. This is a real thing, not just a flashy data science visualization. But we look at these player fit questions in a few different ways. They start from the same place, but they're different flavors of the same question. So one way to look at this is to make player clusters. So we can take this entire world of players and turn them into these color-coded clusters you see here on the right. And so we can look at those. Someone with soccer knowledge can go in and label those and say, who are the best examples of a box-to-box style midfielder? Or let's say we have two openings at forward, and we want to have complementary players, so they're not literally or figuratively stepping on each other's toes. Let's say we want one who's more of a setup creator type and one who's more of a play finisher. We can find two players that are both forwards, but they're in different kinds of clusters. Another way of flipping this problem on its head is to look at similarity scores. So we can measure the distance between two players in the space and say, for example, that if you're watching a Premier League game, there might be a player whose style you really appreciate, who you'd like to have on your team, which is out of your price range. So we can look at the entire other world of players, identify players with similar tendencies, filter to your budget, filter to ages, and find someone who's the right fit for you, who can bring that style to your team, even if they're not the same player that was in your ideal first example. Another one that came up a lot on the team side is that we would have players who we had 3 years ago who were absolutely perfect, and then for whatever reason they left or aged out or they weren't available, and we wanted someone else to fill that role, but in the present. So we can do this same model, but with past players as well, and look at how well current players are exhibiting the tendencies of that past player that we wanted to copy. And finally, we have the fit score on the bottom. Fit score is how we work with customers to identify the ideal stats they value in certain positions, or the player archetypes they really want to copy, and we can assign a single number to how well each player around the world fits those ideals. And we can track that number over time. We can track how well the players on your own roster are exemplifying these ideals that you want to exhibit. So we can give you a single number for the entire world of players about how well they would fit on your roster. The last one to talk about today is league translations. So we talked about player talent and player fit. If everyone played in the same league, we'd be all set. Of course, they don't. So you have to evaluate, is great production against average competition better than average production against great competition? You might be tempted to just say, let's look at the players that played in one league, then played in the next league, track their change in production, and that's our exchange rate. And that's a fine place to start, but you can run into issues with small sample sizes, with outliers throwing off your data. You can even get these weird scenarios where League A is better than B, B is better than C, and C is better than A, this bad paper, rock, scissors loop, which is a tough place to start any analysis from. So we can take those same translations, though, and build a network visualization. So let's say we want to look at how players translate from Brazil into the Premier League. If you look just at their direct translations, they are 80% as productive using our all-in-one metric when they go from Brazil to the Premier League. But that's not the only transition players can make. You can go from Brazil to Italy, Brazil to France, then Italy to the Premier League, and France to the Premier League. And we can track all of these performances across different leagues and how well those translate, and build this entire network of all the possible lead translations, and really explodes our sample size of players that are available to us. So in this example, if we combine all these data, we learn that the players going from Brazil to the Premier League are actually 78% as productive. So that was a relatively small change. But this graph has a very good example. La Liga to the Premier League, players actually got more productive. But if you run this entire thing through the network graph, the coefficient is 0.86, so players are actually less productive. So an analyst that only looked at this translation would say that La Liga is stronger than the Premier League. But if you run it through the entire network visualization, you get the opposite result. So now we've covered all the fun data problems, and Jake's going to talk about how we take those results and make them more actionable for our customers.
Thank you, Zach. So as you can see, for those who were here in December, we've really narrowed our focus and figured out how teams need these problems solved compared to what they have time for in their day-to-day. What we find is that most people in this room and working for teams want to focus on football analytics. That's the fun stuff. That's what their bosses care about. If you're doing data engineering, you want to be doing feature engineering and data enrichment. You don't want to be creating and babysitting database architecture. If you're doing data science, you don't want to be going from 0 to 100. You want to be fine-tuning. If you're doing software development, you want to be doing unique reports and bespoke projects, not building production applications in mobile from 0. So we fill in these 4 on the outside and let you do the fun part. This is kind of how it works. So we create a cloud database in Snowflake for all of our customers, or if you have one, we plug into it. We partner with all of the major data vendors. So if you work with StatsBomb, if you work with Impact, if you work with Skill Corner, just keep paying your bills. When you log in, you're going to have all of your data automated and enriched. Then in the middle, you have the models that Zach just talked about. And with our focus now on Talent ID, by the end of the year, we'll have a lot of roster level analysis and then work on tactics next year. But that all is realized through a mobile experience. Users, such as sporting directors, scouts, heads of recruitment, can log into their application, see all of the models that Zach just talked about on top of your data, or your own models and your own analyses that you've built through our API, and they can create watch lists. Who here listens to music on Spotify? So who likes sending their friends a playlist? Or if you hear a new song that you like, you click Go to Song Radio, and it makes you a new playlist of songs that you haven't heard before. We're inspired by that. So we're allowing you to create watch lists of players. Maybe it's young players to keep an eye on. Maybe it's just top targets or deep lying playmakers or inverted fullbacks. But maybe you find a player that you really like Zach mentioned, and you want to create a whole new list of players that you haven't seen before. We also allow you to work from those positional profiles that Zach mentioned through our clustering analyses and build out through your own terminology how you call each type of position and look at players, filter them through based on what criteria is important to you. Even type in natural language, for example, show me sweeper keepers between age 20 and 28 that cost less than 10 million and rank them by goals saved above average. And then it's going to create a list for you. And in the player page, you can see what your scouts think. You can see an AI summary of all the reports. And you can display whatever metrics matter most to you and easily share this information with your colleagues. That's obviously just the tip of the iceberg. You'll want to see reports and you'll want to see alerts. For example, when a youth player that you're keeping an eye on debuted in the top league or for their senior team. You'll want to keep notes, like if an agent is difficult to deal with or if a player really wants to move to London. You'll want to be able to forecast what's this player going to cost in 3 years if they keep up this production, so we can decide to sell them this year versus next year. And finally, we're creating a recommendation engine so that the app can send you players that you haven't thought of that might be just outside your criteria. Obviously, this is just the beginning. We're very excited to deliver this mobile app. We're already in the NFL, college basketball, and European soccer, but I hope that our first Brazilian customer is in this room. Thanks for your time. Questions?
So the first question, if a club signs with Gemini, how is the process of integrating the club's data to the platform and have the models and predictions available?
Yeah, great question, Hugo. So we have a team of data engineers who will obviously open up your database or create one for you, work with the data vendors that you are already working with, and basically architect that and set it up for you. Depending on how much enrichment you've already done or how many template models you have that you want to put into the backend, we would then help you create that and give you access to our API so that you can tweak and configure anything you need as you go. Then we would go on site where you are and configure what we would call the semantic layer, which is really just what do you call things and how do you talk at your club? What does passing mean to you? What is a fullback called in your org? And we set that up, and we train some natural language models in the background, and we make sure that you know where all the buttons are. And then you have support throughout the year, because your success is our success.
Awesome. I guess this one directed more towards Zach. Thinking that football is divided in smaller problems, attacking, pressing, passing, defending, how to balance an all-in-one metric with all these different contexts?
Yeah, I mean, each of those is an input into a good all-in-one metric, but the same style model often works for other kinds of things as well. So coming from the basketball world, we have this all-in-one metric of player talent, but we can make the same thing for how they impact rebounding, how they impact shot blocking, how they impact finishing around the rim. So you can build a lot of the same architecture with a different target instead of just goal differential or point differential in basketball. You can point the same architecture at the problem you're trying to solve for, and often it works just as well.
Yeah. Next one. How can Gemini Sports help in the selling process of players relating to identifying better markets that would better suit the players that a club wants to sell?
Yeah, I think if this is the most underserved problem in sports analytics, I think it's amazing how much time is spent on buying players, but not actually figuring out what's the right price for them or what's the right time to sell. You know, I'm amazed when I ask sporting directors, why did you sell the player for that price? And they say, well, that's what the agent asked for, or that's what transfermarket.com said. I don't think either of those are great answers. I know a lot of companies try to make an estimated transfer value. I don't know if anyone solved it really well, but I think that at least having a data-driven starting point for negotiations is extremely important, but also figuring out the timing of when to sell a player based on a time series analysis of, obviously, if a player continues to develop is key for teams. So that's all being integrated.
Yeah. How different is the data in analytics in different sports? How does it vary when working with a basketball team compared to a football team?
Yeah, I think every sport has certain elements in common and certain elements that are different. Basketball and soccer both have this nice flow element to them that, for example, baseball doesn't have. But obviously, a soccer pitch is many times larger than a basketball court and with twice as many players out there as well. So there's some challenges that overlap and some challenges that are unique to every sport. But that's also what makes it fun to work in sports analytics, right? That we all get to encounter different problems every day.
I guess.
Sorry, Hugo, I'll just add to that. You know, Zach and I have talked a lot about like regularized adjusted plus minus that Zach built, you know, and worked with at the Miami Heat. In basketball, players come on and off the field so frequently, on and off the court. And in soccer, that doesn't happen as much, even with 5 sub rules in certain leagues now. But what we're seeing is, you know, with so many more games being played globally, there's a lot of lineup changes. There's a lot of rotation. And so I think that's a really fun math problem to solve. And we're going to see it keep growing.
How do you adjust models in general when dealing with sports that contain a lot of set plays like basketball, baseball, in a more chaotic sport like football?
Yeah. Something that I have to keep in mind as I work in a different sport too is that if you're making a model for football, it doesn't have to compete against the best baseball model or the best basketball model. A model might be more suited to one of those sports, but it doesn't mean it doesn't deliver value in the football landscape. So a football model isn't competing against basketball models, it's competing against the other models in its space. So that's something to keep in mind as well. That like different architectures are suited to different kinds of problems, but you got to keep in mind that like what is the hurdle that we're trying to clear with this model? What is the problem we're trying to solve here? Not what is the absolute ideal state that anyone could possibly achieve with a crystal ball.
Thank you, guys.